In this pickups video, I've got one of my personal retro gaming grails, as well as a game that was recently banned and delisted from all online marketplaces. Let's get into it. Welcome back to the channel. In this pickups video, I definitely have some interesting games to show you guys, including that banned game that I talked about in the opening segment. But before we get into that, let's get started with the first game here, and that game is Senses Midnight on the PS5. So this is a 3D survival horror game with fixed camera angles and tank controls. Much like a lot of the old Resident Evil games, this game leans into more atmosphere and psychological tension rather than action. And it's actually a sequel to another game called Senses, a cyberpunk ghost story. That game's actually a 2D survival horror game, but this is a standalone game that doesn't require you to play the first game. And I guess the premise of this game is you're a girl who's alone in a park, trying to figure out some mystery that happens at midnight. One of the interesting things about this game is it actually has a camera mechanic, much like the Fatal Frame games. If you've ever played any of those on the PS2, watching some of the reviews and some of the gameplay, it definitely has an indie vibe to it, so I expect a little bit of jankiness. I don't know that it'll be as polished as like a Resident Evil game or anything like that. Recently, it was actually known for being one of the more expensive games on the PS5. This game at one point for a few months actually got upwards of almost $200. This is a PlayAsia exclusive, and for a little bit there, it looked like this game was no longer available on the PlayAsia website. So what ended up happening is the price of this game skyrocketed. However, since then, PlayAsia did re-release it on their website, and last time I checked recently, it was still available. So if you're interested in this game, I would suggest maybe buying a copy from PlayAsia, just in case it becomes no longer available again on their website, and those prices start to climb back up. So again, that is Senses Midnight on the PS5. All right, next game on the list is Sonic X Shadow Generations on the PS5. So this is a remaster of the original Sonic Generations game, and I've actually never played a 3D Sonic game after Sonic Adventure 2. From what I understand, a lot of those games were hit or miss, but the original Sonic Generations game was one of the games that reviewed well, and people really seemed to enjoy that game. This game is a remaster of the original Sonic Generations game with an extra campaign for Shadow. From what I understand, the Shadow levels are some of the best 3D Sonic levels to date. This game blends both 2D and 3D gameplay levels with some classic Sonic levels mixed in, including Green Hill Zone, which I'm really excited to check out in 3D for the first time. I did choose to buy this game on the PS5 as opposed to the Nintendo Switch because it actually runs at 60 frames per second on the PS5 versus 30 frames on the Nintendo Switch. And in one of the reviews that I watched for this game, someone said it might actually be the best 3D Sonic to date, so I'm really excited to check this one out. I did make the cardinal sin of video game collecting with this game, and I somehow accidentally bought 2 copies of this game. The game went on sale for very cheap on Amazon. I think I paid maybe $12 for it. And so I bought it when I saw it go on sale. And I guess a couple weeks after that, it went on sale again, and I had forgot that I had already purchased it. And so when the game arrived and I went to go file it into my collection and put it with my other games, I realized that I had 2 copies. So I don't know what I'm gonna do with these. One of these I think actually has a loose disc, so I'll probably open that one up and play it. Maybe I'll keep the other copy sealed and just keep it in my collection for a while, but yeah, 2 copies of Sonic X Shadow Generations going into the collection, so. All right, next game on the list, Shadow Dancer on the Sega Genesis is one of my favorite games of all time. It's one of the games that I grew up with. We had a Sega Genesis growing up, and I just love that game. Even to this day, I still play through the game probably once a year or so. And if you're not familiar with what Shadow Dancer is, it's actually a spin-off from the Shinobi series. It is a Shinobi game based in the Shinobi universe, but it's not titled a mainline Shinobi game. And even though I love that game, I've actually never played any other Shinobi game. There's one Shinobi game in particular on the Sega Genesis that some not only call one of the best Shinobi games of all time, but one of the best games on the Sega Genesis, and that game is Shinobi 3 for the Sega Genesis. And for me, this is one of my personal retro gaming grails, not because the game is super expensive, although they were asking $90 for the game, but I think we settled at $85 for the game, so it still wasn't a cheap game. But the reason it's one of my personal retro gaming grails is because it's a game I've been wanting to buy for a long time, and for some reason the stars just never aligned to where I found a clean copy out in the wild. So I ended up just pulling the trigger and buying the game off of eBay, which isn't something that I typically like to do for retro games, but I've just been wanting this game for so long that I couldn't wait any longer, so I did buy it from eBay. This version here is a pretty clean copy. It is complete with the instruction manual and the poster that comes with the game, which is actually pretty cool. So if you unravel the poster, it's actually a poster for the original Jurassic Park movie. This thing just looks so cool. Shinobi 3 came out, I think, in 1993, right around the time that this movie came out. So this is definitely something that I wanted to make sure came with the game that I bought. Super happy to have Shinobi 3 finally in the collection, and I cannot wait to play this game. All right, next game on the list is Penny's Big Breakaway on the Nintendo Switch. This is a 3D platform, and it's actually made from the team that made Sonic Mania. And you can really see that in the DNA of this game. It's a very fast-paced game. It's very bright and very colorful. And it has this yo-yo mechanic, kind of like Cappy from Odyssey, where it transforms and allows you to do different things with the yo-yo. You can ride it, swing it and use it as a weapon, and even use it as a grappling hook where you can swing with it, almost like when you're playing a Spider-Man game when you're using your webs to traverse through the city. Like I said, this is a pretty fast-paced game, and the Nintendo Switch version of this game was actually known to have a little bit of frame rate issues. However, I will be playing this on my Switch 2, and I guess on the Switch 2 it runs pretty flawlessly at 60 frames per second, so that's how I'll be playing it. Pretty excited to have this one. I love 3D platform games, so can't wait to dive into this one and check it out. All right, next game on the list is Fear Effect on the Nintendo Switch. So this is actually a re-release of an action-adventure game that was a cult classic on the original PS1. This game has a really interesting art style. It's got some of the early cel-shaded graphics, and it's very cinematic with a lot of cutscenes. And another interesting thing about this game is it was actually one of the first games to use full motion video for the backgrounds. And because the game had a lot of cutscenes and it utilized the full motion video backgrounds, the original game on the PS1 actually came with 4 discs to hold all that content. Like I said, this is more of a re-release as opposed to a remaster. They did make some quality of life improvements to the game to make it a little more accessible. They've added modder controls instead of having the original tank controls. And I guess they've added a quick save feature, which makes the game much easier to get through. I've never played the original game on the PS1, but I guess it was known for being pretty unfair in some of its deaths. Really excited to get into this one, if not for anything, just to check out that unique art style from the early 2000s. So that is Fear Effect on the Nintendo Switch. All right, next game on the list is the Turok Trilogy Bundle for the Nintendo Switch. If you're unfamiliar with the Turok games, they are first-person shooter games from the Nintendo 64 with large maze-like levels. These games actually focused on exploration just as much as they did on the first-person shooter combat. These games are remastered to improve performance and controls. If you're unfamiliar with the original Turok games, some of those games were known for having some of the worst frame rate issues on the Nintendo 64. I think Turok 2 especially was known for having less than 20 frames per second when there was a lot of action going on or there was a lot of elements on the screen. However, with this remaster, all the games run at a smooth 60 frames per second. Like I said, the controls were also updated for these games. If you remember the Nintendo 64 controller, it only had one analog stick. I've only played the original Turok for the Nintendo 64. I had a Nintendo 64 growing up. It was one of the games that I had, but I've never played Turok 2 or Turok 3, so I'm really excited to check out Turok 2 and Turok 3 with this collection. All right, next game on the list is Soul Reaver 1 and 2 Remastered for the Nintendo Switch. So these are remasters of games that came out on the PS1 and the PS2. They are 3D action-adventure games with a lot of puzzle platforming elements. They are part of the Legacy of Kain series, which are known for their dark and gothic storytelling. These games focus a lot on exploration and puzzle solving, and these are considered really excellent remasters of the games. The developers had access to the original source code and assets for these games, so it's not just an upscaled version of the original games. There were a lot of new assets that were used throughout the game. For example, the main characters, some of the bosses, and other elements of the game used modern and updated assets. But what's really cool is if you prefer the original assets, you can actually switch back and forth between the modern ones and the original ones with the click of a button. These games are known for having a really good story and excellent voice acting that holds up still to this day very well. I never played these games. I didn't own a PlayStation 1 growing up. I did have a PS2, so I guess I could have checked them out at some point, but they were just games that I never got around to and played, so excited to see what these games are all about. I know a lot of people love these games, and this is supposed to be a really good remaster of the games, so this will certainly be one I check out soon here at some point. Again, that is Soul Reaver 1 and 2 Remastered on the Nintendo Switch. All right, next game on the list is Remember Me on the PS3. I don't know how, but somehow this game escaped me. I don't recall this game coming out, and it's actually not a game that I hear talked about often, but it is a game developed by Capcom, and it is a AAA game with high production value, and it's got a really interesting and unique premise. I guess you play as a memory hunter, where you manipulate and alter memories. And the game looks great. It looks like it's very cinematic. The graphics look really good for the time. And in the gameplay videos that I checked out, it looks like it still holds up really well today. The story and the setting are also supposed to be really good. But I guess some of the critiques for this game that make people look back on it not too fondly is that it had pretty repetitive and shallow combat from what I understand. And I guess it was too linear at the time when everyone was pushing open world games when this game came out. But I kind of like that. Not every game has to be a 40 or 50 hour plus open world game, especially now that I'm getting older and it's getting harder and harder to find time to play these games that are 50 or 100 plus hours. So a linear, more focused game actually doesn't sound too bad for me. But it just feels like one of those games that people either forgot about or just really don't talk about too often. At least I don't hear people talk about this game much, which is pretty ironic because the game's actually called Remember Me. And so I'm really excited to check this one out. I did watch an old GameSpot review, and they said this was a good game that could have been great. So it's not like it reviewed terribly where people said it was a bad game. So I don't know. It just seems like it's one of those games for some reason just people don't really look back on or talk about much. But we're really excited to check this one out. That is Remember Me on the PlayStation 3. All right, next game on the list. That is Star Ocean First Departure R on the Nintendo Switch. So the Star Ocean series actually started back on the Super Famicom. However, the games never made it to North America until one of the Super Famicom games were actually remade on the PSP. And what this game is it's actually a remaster of that PSP game. The thing that really drew me into this game is the art style. It's got pre-rendered backgrounds with these pixel characters that just make the game look really interesting and unique. And the other thing that I found really interesting about this game is that it actually uses real-time combat instead of turn-based combat like most of the other RPG games used at the time. The game reviewed well, and I think what finally sold me on the game is that you can actually beat the game in about 20 to 25 hours, because like I said, it's getting harder and harder to find time to beat these overly long games. So not too bad, 20 to 25 hours, I can find time for that, so excited to get into this and check this game out. And again, that is Star Ocean First Departure R for the Nintendo Switch. Keeping in line with the RPG theme, the next game on the list is Dragon Quest VII Reimagined for the PS5. So if you aren't familiar with the Dragon Quest games, they are traditional JRPGs or Japanese role-playing games. The original Dragon Quest VII game actually came out on the PlayStation 1. It was actually called Dragon Warrior 7, but then there was a 3D remake of Dragon Quest VII that came out on the Nintendo 3DS. This is actually a completely reimagined or different version of that 3DS game. This isn't like an updated version of that game. It's called Dragon Quest VII Reimagined because it is completely different in the graphical style. There were things that were added and removed from this game compared to the 3DS game. And this version on the PS5 is considered to be much more accessible due to a lot of the quality of life updates than the previous Dragon Quest VII games. You can beat this game in around 50 hours compared to the previous versions. Dragon Warrior 7 on the PS1 was known to be one of the longest JRPGs at the time. It could take you upwards of over 100 hours to beat that game. The only other Dragon Quest game that I ever played was Dragon Quest XI on the Nintendo Switch, and I absolutely loved that game. And ever since then, I've been wanting to play through all the other Dragon Quest games, so I'm really excited to have this in the collection to play through it. It's one of the many Dragon Quest games that I now own that I gotta find time to play through at some point, but really excited to have this in the collection. And again, that is Dragon Quest VII Reimagined on the PlayStation 5. All right, so we've got 3 more games left, so on to the next game. And that game is Alan Wake 2 on the PS5. So this is a sequel to the original Alan Wake game. And the original Alan Wake game came out on the Xbox 360. The game was eventually remastered for the PS5, the Xbox Series X, and the PC. And this is actually a deluxe version of Alan Wake 2 that comes with a digital version of Alan Wake Remastered. I actually own the physical version of Alan Wake Remastered as well. However, I've not played through it. I will at some point because it's definitely a game that is right up my alley and the type of games that I love. And these games are kind of survival horror games. Some people say they're more of an adventure or narrative game with survival horror elements. But these games get a lot of praise for their storytelling and atmosphere. And these games have a really unique combat system where I guess you have to use light to remove the shield from your enemies before they can take any additional damage. So that's pretty interesting. I think I probably own the original Alan Wake on the Xbox 360 somewhere back here in the collection. I never got around to playing it. I've got so many games in my backlog that I have to get through. I'll have another video coming up soon to talk through that a little more and how I plan to get through my backlog. But until then, this joins the backlog until I find some time to play through the first Alan Wake and then this. Next game on the list is Shinobi Art of Vengeance on the PS5. So this is Sega's attempt to try to revive the Shinobi series. This is a modern Shinobi game. It was released on both the PS5 and the Nintendo Switch. And just like the other Shinobi games, this is a 2D action platformer. This game has a really nice hand-drawn art style. It's a little less linear than the original Shinobi games. And I guess this game introduced a combo system, which looks pretty cool from what I could see in the gameplay. And the game reviewed really well. Just like Penny's Big Breakaway earlier in the video, this game did have a little bit of frame rate issues and some stuttering on the Nintendo Switch, which is why I opted to get the PS5 version of the game. And this game too, I think was only like $29.99. I think that's the normal retail price of the game, the normal MSRP price, so it's not a very expensive game. But again, it reviewed really well, so I'm excited to check this out, excited to keep diving into the Shinobi games. Like I said, with as much as I loved Shadow Dancer, it's time for me to start playing these other Shinobi games. So I've got Shinobi 3, and now I've got a modern version of Shinobi, so really excited to check these games out. All right, we are on to the last game, and that game is Speedolama on the PS4. So this is a wacky run and gun game where you play as some anti-hero llama. Apparently there was some type of problems with the ESRB rating for this game. And this game was actually delisted from all online marketplaces. And the company that published this game was actually ordered to destroy or sell through all their copies within 14 days. I guess there's something in the game with some female llamas that were, I guess, a little overly sexualized, we'll say. But the game only had a teen rating, which should have had an M rating because of that. It's still not exactly clear how that happened. I heard it could possibly be that what was submitted to the ESRB didn't contain all the necessary information to give it the proper rating. And there's even some reports out there that suggest that maybe they put their own ESRB rating on the game without submitting the proper approval to do so. But whatever the case, this game is now no longer available on any of the online marketplaces, and you can no longer buy it physically from the website. They sold through all their copies. This was a very limited print game. They were actually selling 2 versions of the game on their website. They had the standard version here on both the PS4 and the PS5, and they also had a steelbook version of each game. The steelbook version of those games were limited to, I think, 1,000 copies each, but the standard versions were limited to 200 copies apiece on both the PS4 and the PS5. Fortunately, I was able to get the standard version for the PS4, but I also was able to get the steelbook version for the PS5. The publisher of these games already said they're not going to go through the process of getting the proper ESRB rating attached to these games because they're just out of funds. So it sounds like these games may never be available physically again. And because of that, the price of these games has skyrocketed. These games are going for eBay upwards of $200, even $300 last time I checked. So I was fortunate enough to get a copy on both the PS4 and the PS5. And so I have a feeling these will one day become the rarest games in my collection. A run and gun game with llamas. Who would have ever thought? All right, that is everything in this pickups video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider liking and subscribing. And until next time, I'll see you later.